The measurement of museum social impact project addresses the critical need of establishing best practices for measuring social impact within the museum field, both regarding individuals and communities. We're very happy to have two members of the MOMSI team, as it's called, presenting the project today. As Dr. Michelle Mileham, Project Manager of MOMSI, and Emily Johnson, Museum Services Manager, are unable to join us that early from Utah, this is a pre-recorded session with no live Q&A. Still, please do write your questions online, as we will have the opportunity to share them with the MOMSI team and discuss in the future.
Hello, and welcome to today's discussion of our project, MOMSI, or Measurement of Museum Social Impact. My name is Emily Johnson.
And I'm Michelle Mileham.
We're both here today representing the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. Historically, museums have successfully measured economic impact, the money museums bring into their communities, either directly or indirectly, and educational impact through learning outcomes and relationships with formal schools. But social impact is more elusive and challenging to measure. And there's a gap in museum research and practice on exactly how to measure social impact. Our team is working to fill that gap. We recognize that there are many ways of defining social impact. They may be different from museum to museum, but for the purpose of our work, we define social impact as the effect of an activity on the social fabric of a community and the well-being of the individuals and the families who live there. We measure this through 4 long-term outcomes: continued learning and engagement, increased health and well-being, valuing diverse communities, and strengthened relationships. All of this started with a social impact study at Thanksgiving Point, a multi-museum complex just south of Salt Lake City, Utah. They were in the midst of completing an economic impact study when a consultant recommended that they also measure social impact to obtain a more holistic view of their museum's impact. The results of their social impact study were shared with funders and legislators and ultimately led to Thanksgiving Point receiving funds for a new building and exhibit. While Thanksgiving Point is in a position to do this, most Utah museums are not, in that they have Thanksgiving Point have a large staff and a department specifically dedicated to research and evaluation. As a state agency, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums felt it was imperative to help other museums measure their social impact, particularly those who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity or capacity to do this kind of work. So the project was piloted with 8 museums across the state. We at Utah Arts and Museums started reaching out to those in our vicinity who we recognized as having the capacity and the interest in participating in something like this. We brought 8 representative museums on board in the summer of 2017, and they agreed to be guinea pigs of sorts for a social impact study of museums in Utah. As a team, we rewrote the logic model governing the Thanksgiving Point study. We rewrote the survey questions. We developed marketing strategies for recruiting participants and retaining them through a visit and survey process. The host sites took on much of the responsibility for recruiting participants at their museums. Utah Arts Museums wanted them to be able to utilize whatever communication methods worked best for them to contact their audiences and communities, however they chose to identify those groups. Utah Arts and Museum staff, this is me, provided training for museums' front of house staff before the study opened. For the purposes of the pilot, Utah Arts and Museum staff were engaged in extensive communication and contact with the study takers for each museum site. Rather than each museum managing their own recruited study subjects, we managed them centrally at Utah Arts and Museums. In part, to keep the burden of this amount of communication, it was a lot, from individual staff at museums we were trying to provide a service for, and in part to maintain ownership of the project and all personal data we collected from being the responsibility of the host sites, and there wasn't a lot of that. The results of our pilot study were very promising. Over the 8 sites, we had nearly 400 responses to our survey, And 96% of the 104 survey indicators showed a statistically significant positive change. We broke down our results according to the 4 long-term impacts that I noted earlier. Please see here that there was a change in the title of this long-term outcome from intercultural competence in the pilot to valuing diverse community in the MOMSI project as we proceeded with our project and made several changes based on better practices. 94% of responses in the health and well-being category showed a statistically significant positive change, along with 100% of the indicators in the intercultural competence category. Here's the same data for the other 2 outcomes. For continued education and engagement, 100% of the indicators showed a statistically significant positive change, and 91% of the indicators in strengthened relationships did the same.
Thanks, Emily. And now I'm going to share a little bit about how we took those Utah findings and scaled up to a national U.S. museum social impact study. So as Emily said, the Measurement of Museum Social Impact Project, or like we like to call it, MOMSI, is funded thanks to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is a national granting agency here in the United States. So we are now able to scale up the Utah pilot to a national level. MOMSI seeks to provide social impact data directly to the participating museums, testing the methods that we used during the Utah pilot. But it also helps to further validate the social impact survey and ultimately develop a social impact toolkit for museums to use. So we went about selecting U.S. museums as host sites, and we really wanted to look for the diversity of the museum field in the U.S., looking specifically at region, because we realized there may be regional differences to how people would respond to the social impact statements on a survey. We also considered content area because we wanted everything from art museums to zoos to be included in this project. And we also considered staff size and budget size. So like the Utah pilot, we want to test how this kind of study can work in small museums with limited capacity, with smaller staff sizes and museums in more rural areas. So not only do we want these museums to better understand their social impact, we also want to understand how this kind of study does or does not work in their spaces, because that's critical information when we're designing the toolkit and associated resources. So we recruited 4 host museums through a couple of different methods. We looked first and used partnerships with national professional organizations like the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the American Alliance of Museums, and Public Gardens Association. But we also relied on contacts through regional museum associations, blogs, and even direct outreach. So we ultimately had 71 museums apply to participate in this project. Keep in mind, our applications were open March through May of 2021, as COVID-19 was still heavily impacting museums being open or was requiring museums to operate with limited capacity and with limited staff. The pins on this map show all of the applicant museums. So it shows all 71 applicants, and you can see their regional diversity here. From those applicants, we selected 38 museums to serve as host sites for MOMSI. So this map now shows where those 38 selected sites are, and you can see that we did select based on the regional diversity that applicant pool allowed us to consider. And these are our 38 participating museums, and you can see that they represent art museums, historical museums, historic houses, specialty museums like aviation museums and African American history museums, gardens, and zoos. Some are in large urban settings, while others are in towns of 400 people. And they range from having 100 or more staff members to only having an executive director as a paid staff. So again, we really picked these 38 sites for that diversity and representation of museums here in the United States. So we do ask some very specific things of each of our participating museums. First, they have to recruit and select up to 100 participants from their own local communities. They then have to provide free admission to each of those participants and a guest of the participant's choice. And they do so for 3 separate visits to the museum. We then work with each museum to track the visits of each participant. After each participant's 3rd and final visit, our project team sends participants the social impact survey, which will be hosted in an online survey platform. We are then also responsible for analyzing the results and will write a report for each museum about their social impact and help them interpret the results. As a reminder, we define and measure social impact through 4 long-term outcomes: continued learning and engagement, health and well-being, valuing diverse communities, and strengthened relationships. The survey museum visitors take includes questions that relate back to each one of those outcomes. As Emily had mentioned, we had 104 statements on the social impact tool for the Utah pilot. For this national study, we narrowed that down to about 50 statements. Our team will share more about the survey and each of the statements and how we did some reliability analysis to help narrow down that survey during our masterclass on Friday. So I'm not going to dive into it much here. Along with the social impact statements, we also have a handful of open-ended questions. In the Utah pilot, a lot of museums reflected that the responses they received from open-ended questions on the survey were really meaningful. So we included some here that were both representative of what we had in the Utah pilot, but also some new questions that our host museums helped us develop. So we're asking some that are pretty typical of experience surveys. So what was somebody's most memorable experience at the museum? What, if anything, did they dislike about their experience? But we also wanted to include questions that relate back to social impact. And those include, in what ways, if any, did the museum change the way you interact with others? How does this museum benefit your community? And how did participating in the study change your perspective of museums and cultural sites? And those last 2 questions are the new ones that our host museums helped us develop. So finally, I said that MOMSI concludes with a social impact toolkit that will be free and accessible to museums. Working with our 38 host museums here in the US will help us shape this toolkit, which will be available in 2023. The toolkit will include resources to help museums of all kinds and sizes to measure their own social impact. So why measure social impact? We want to end by sharing the reasons we believe social impact is important for museums to measure and why our project is specifically designed to culminate with a social impact toolkit for museums to use. So first and foremost, findings can be shared with funders, stakeholders, and legislators. So helping to get funding for your site specifically, as we saw was successful with Thanksgiving Point. It also allows you to inform strategic, master, and interpretive planning. Museums can use findings from this to help shape marketing and public relations. You can also take the opportunity for audience outreach and development. So connecting with those who you may already have as a museum audience, but also identifying who maybe isn't at your museum and ways to get them to your museum to measure its impact. And you can also use it to apply for grants and recruit board members. And in the words of one of our host museums for the Utah pilot, quote, "It was clear to see where we were strong and where we were weak as a museum." And MOMSI really wants to help each museum identify their strengths and their weaknesses to be better museums and to better serve their communities. So thanks for joining us today. Both my and Emily's contact information is shared here with you if you'd like to reach out with any questions. Our team will also be co-presenting a masterclass on Friday where you can learn more about the national study. You can also learn more about MOMSI and follow along with our progress at museumsocialimpact.org.